James walked down the quiet street, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the pavement. He had never been the kind of guy women noticed. On dating apps, his messages went unanswered. In real life, he was just another face in the crowd. Women barely spared him a glance, and rejection had become so normal that he didn't even feel it anymore. Tonight was just another reminder of that. Another failed attempt at finding someone who actually cared. The wind was cold, but James didn't bother pulling his jacket tighter. What was the point? He had no one to go home to, no one waiting for him. He sighed and kicked a stray rock as he walked. The streets were nearly empty, and the only sound was the distant hum of cars and the occasional rustling of leaves. Then, out of nowhere, the sky flashed bright white. James stopped in his tracks, shielding his eyes as a blinding light tore through the night. The ground shook beneath his feet, and a deafening boom followed. He barely had time to process what was happening before a flaming object came crashing down in the distant woods, sending up a massive plume of smoke and fire. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then distant sirens started wailing. James stood frozen, heart hammering. What the hell was that? A plane crash? A meteor? His first instinct was to walk away. Let the authorities handle it. But something inside him, some deep, gut feeling, told him to go. So he ran. Through the streets, past the empty park, and into the darkened forest where the glow of the crash site still flickered in the distance. His breath came in ragged gasps, and sweat dripped down his forehead as he pushed through thick branches and undergrowth. And then he saw it. A metallic pod, half buried in the earth, smoke rising from its scorched surface. It was unlike anything James had ever seen, smooth, sleek, and alien. The air smelled of burnt metal, and faint blue lights flickered along its cracked exterior. James swallowed hard and stepped closer. That was when he saw her. Lying beside the pod was a woman, or at least she looked like one. Her skin shimmered in the firelight, a soft, glowing blue. Strange, delicate markings ran down her arms, glowing faintly like bioluminescent tattoos. Her long, silver-white hair was tangled, and her eyes, large, deep, and filled with pain, flickered open to meet his. James froze. He had no idea what to do. She was bleeding, her clothes torn, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. She tried to move, but a sharp gasp of pain escaped her lips. She was hurt. James hesitated for only a second before kneeling beside her. "Hey, can you hear me?" His voice came out shaky, but gentle. The woman blinked, her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but her body trembled with exhaustion. James looked back toward the streets. He could hear the sirens getting closer. If someone else found her, what would they do? Would they help? Or would they take her away? Experiment on her? His gut told him to act fast. Without another thought, James carefully slipped his arms under her and lifted her up. She was lighter than he expected, her body warm despite the night's chill. She let out a soft sound, half a sigh, half a groan, but didn't resist. Heart pounding, James turned and hurried back the way he came, deeper into the shadows before anyone else could find them. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what he had just gotten himself into. But he knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same again. James moved quickly through the dark streets, the alien woman's body light in his arms. His heart pounded, not just from the effort of carrying her, but from the weight of what he had just done. He had taken an injured, unknown being from a crash site, an alien. The thought sent chills down his spine, but he knew he couldn't stop now. The sirens were getting louder, and if someone else found her, she might not survive the night. He reached his apartment, struggling to open the door while still holding her. Once inside, he gently laid her down on his couch, his mind racing. What now? Should he call someone? A hospital? No, that was stupid. Who would believe him? And if they did, she would end up locked away in some secret facility. The woman stirred, a soft groan escaping her lips. James knelt beside her, watching as her silver-white lashes fluttered open. Her glowing blue eyes locked onto his, filled with confusion and pain. "You're safe," James said, unsure if she understood. Her gaze darted around the room, taking in her surroundings. When she tried to sit up, a sharp breath of pain stopped her. James reached out instinctively, but hesitated before touching her. "You're hurt," he said softly. "You need to rest." Her lips parted as if to speak, but the words that came out were in a language he couldn't understand. It was soft, melodic, and completely alien. James swallowed hard. This was real. She was real. He got up and hurried to his bathroom, grabbing a first aid kit. He wasn't sure if human medicine would work on her, but he had to try. He returned and crouched beside her again, carefully pulling aside the torn fabric of her clothing. Beneath it, her skin shimmered faintly, marked with those strange glowing lines. Some of them pulsed slightly, almost like veins. James focused on the wound near her ribs, deep, but not bleeding as much as he had expected. He reached for some antiseptic, pausing just before applying it. "This might hurt," he warned. She watched him, her glowing eyes unreadable. Slowly, she gave a small nod. James carefully dabbed at the wound. She tensed, her hands gripping the couch, but she didn't make a sound. He wrapped a bandage around her, securing it as gently as possible. When he finished, he sat back, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Better?" he asked. She studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she spoke again. This time, in heavily accented but understandable English. "You help me." James blinked. "You can talk." She nodded slightly. "Not, well, learning." That answer only brought more questions. How did she know any English at all? Had she been here before? How many others like her were out there? "What's your name?" James asked. She hesitated, as if struggling to translate. "Alara," she said finally. "Alara." James repeated it in his mind. It suited her, otherworldly, beautiful. "James," he introduced himself, tapping his own chest. Alara's eyes flickered with understanding. "James," she echoed softly. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of city noise. James had so many questions, but he didn't know where to start. "Where did you come from?" he finally asked. Alara's expression darkened. She glanced toward the window, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. When she spoke, her voice was lower, almost cautious. "Far," she said. "Not safe." James frowned. "Not safe. You mean you're home." She shook her head. "Not home. Running. Escaping." A cold feeling settled in James's gut. She wasn't just some lost traveler. She was on the run. "From who?" he asked carefully. Alara's hands clenched into fists. "Hunters," she whispered. "They find me. They kill me." James's breath caught in his throat. Whatever crash he had seen tonight, it wasn't just an accident. She had been fleeing from something, and if they were still out there, that meant she wasn't safe. And neither was he. Alara turned to him, her glowing eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before. "Fear. They come," she said. "They come soon." James's stomach twisted. He had thought his life was lonely, uneventful. Now, it was about to become a fight for survival. James felt his stomach tighten as Alara's words echoed in his head. "They come soon." He didn't know who these hunters were, but the fear in her glowing blue eyes told him everything. She was running from something dangerous. And now, because he had helped her, he was involved too. A low hum filled the air, faint but growing louder. James's heart pounded. He rushed to his window and peeked through the blinds. The street below was quiet, but something felt wrong. The usual city sounds, cars, distant chatter, seemed muted, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Alara shifted on the couch, wincing as she tried to sit up. James turned back to her, shaking his head. "You need to rest," he said. "You're still hurt." She grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong despite her injuries. "No time," she whispered. "They track me. They are close." James swallowed hard. He had no idea how skilled these hunters were, but if they could track her after a crash, they had to be using advanced technology. He needed to think fast. "Can they detect you here?" he asked. Alara nodded, her silver-white hair falling over her shoulders. "They have." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Scent. Heat. My energy." James ran a hand through his hair. "Great. So, what do we do?" "Fight them." Alara gave him a look that sent a chill down his spine. "Run," she said, "or die." James didn't argue. He grabbed his old backpack and shoved in a few essentials: water, a flashlight, his pocket knife, and a spare hoodie. His mind raced. If these hunters had technology advanced enough to track Alara's energy, hiding in his apartment wouldn't work. They needed to get far away. Fast. He turned back to her. "Can you walk?" Alara gritted her teeth and forced herself onto her feet. She wobbled slightly but steadied herself. "I try." That was good enough for James. He moved to the door, listening. The hallway was silent. He opened it cautiously and peeked out. The apartment building was old, the lights flickering dimly. It felt too quiet. He motioned for Alara to follow, and they slipped into the hallway, keeping close to the walls. They made it to the stairwell, descending quickly. James's pulse was racing. Every shadow felt like a threat. He didn't know what he was expecting. Maybe men in black suits, maybe strange creatures with glowing weapons. But as they reached the lobby, he realized the danger was already inside. The front door was open, swinging slightly in the breeze. The security guard, an older man who usually napped through his shift, was slumped over his desk, unmoving. James's breath hitched. Alara grabbed his arm. "Too late," she whispered. A figure stepped into the doorway. Tall, clad in dark, sleek armor that shimmered under the dim lights. The helmet was smooth, no visible eyes, no mouth. A faint red glow pulsed from the visor. James froze. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying them. Then it stepped forward. Alara reacted instantly. She shoved James aside just as a thin, needle-like projectile shot past where his head had been a second ago. It buried itself into the wall behind him, sizzling. James hit the ground hard, gasping. Alara raised a shaky hand, and for the first time, James saw what she truly was. Her veins pulsed, glowing brighter, and a wave of invisible force rippled through the air, slamming into the armored figure. It staggered back, but didn't fall. "Run," Alara gasped, grabbing James's arm. He didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, dragging Alara with him as they bolted through the side exit. The moment they stepped outside, the cold night air hit them. The city stretched before them. So many places to hide, but also nowhere to truly be safe. Behind them, the door burst open. More figures stepped out, moving in eerie synchronization. No wasted movements, no hesitation. James and Alara sprinted down the alley, their footsteps echoing against the brick walls. James's mind raced. His car was parked a few blocks away. If they could make it. A high-pitched whine filled the air. Alara yanked James sideways, just as a blue energy bolt slammed into the pavement, scorching the ground where they had been standing. "They have plasma weapons," James shouted, barely dodging another shot. Alara didn't answer. She was breathing heavily, her glow flickering. She was pushing herself too hard. James gritted his teeth. He couldn't let her die. Not after he had decided to help her. They turned a corner, and James spotted his car. Relief flooded through him. He dug into his pocket for his keys. Alara suddenly went stiff. "No," she whispered. James looked up. A figure stood by the car, waiting. Unlike the others, this one wasn't wearing a helmet. His face was sharp, inhuman, with deep-set golden eyes that locked onto Alara with cold amusement. "Hello, little fugitive," the alien said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. Alara's breathing turned ragged. James could feel her tension, her fear. The alien hunter took a step forward, his golden eyes flicking to James. "And you," he mused. "A human. Helping her. How? Unexpected." James clenched his fists. He didn't have a plan, no weapons, nothing to fight these things. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let them take her. James stood there, his fists clenched, heart racing, as the alien hunter's cold, golden eyes glared at him. The tension in the air was so thick he could almost taste it. For a moment, everything around him seemed to blur. His mind raced. This wasn't just some alien invader. This was a person, if that's what he could call them, who had hunted Alara for who knows how long. And now he had to stop them. Alara was frozen, her usual glowing aura dimming as she tried to steady herself, her body still weak from the injuries she had sustained earlier. The alien before them was tall, with sharp, angular features and a body built for combat. His stance was confident, predatory. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a hunter, and he had been trained to take down whatever was in his path. "Step aside, human," the alien said, his voice cold and unwavering. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. She is a fugitive, and she must be returned to her people." James glanced at Alara, who was still standing beside him, her eyes filled with fear. She didn't say anything, but he could feel the weight of her worry. She had been running from these hunters for so long, and now they had found her. The thought of her being dragged back to wherever they came from made his blood boil. "I won't let you take her," James said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. He didn't have a plan. He didn't even know how to fight something like this. But he had to try. The alien's lips curled into something that might have been a smile. "You'll die like all the others who stood in our way," he said, his voice low and menacing. James stepped forward, keeping his eyes locked on the alien, trying to ignore the pounding in his chest. He wasn't just going to stand there. Alara had helped him when he had nothing. She had trusted him, and now it was his turn to do the same. Without warning, the alien lunged at him, moving faster than James could react. The energy weapon on his wrist crackled to life, and with a flash of light, it fired. James dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast. The explosion of energy sizzled through the air, scorching the ground where he had been standing just moments before. Alara shouted, her voice filled with desperation. "James, get down." James didn't need to be told twice. He dropped to the ground just as another bolt of energy shot over his head. The alien was relentless, but James could see that he was trying to keep his distance from Alara. He knew that if she was cornered, she'd be able to fight back with the incredible power she held, but right now she was too weak. As the alien advanced, James's mind scrambled for any advantage he could find. His eyes darted around, looking for something, anything, that could help him. That's when he saw it, a large piece of metal debris lying near the alley's edge, part of a destroyed streetlight. It was heavy, but it was also his only chance. Without thinking, he grabbed the debris, lifting it with all his strength, and hurled it toward the alien. The heavy metal slammed into the hunter's side, knocking him off balance. The alien staggered, surprised by the unexpected attack. James didn't waste a second. He rushed forward, fists raised, aiming for the alien's chest. The alien recoiled, clearly not expecting the human to fight back. James's punch landed squarely on the alien's armor, but it barely caused a dent. His heart sank. The armor was too strong for him to break with his bare hands. But then he saw Alara's eyes light up, her body glowing with a soft blue energy. She was ready. With a fierce yell, Alara surged forward, her hand outstretched. She unleashed a wave of energy so powerful that it sent the alien flying backwards, crashing into the wall of a nearby building. The impact shook the ground beneath their feet. The alien groaned, struggling to rise, but he was clearly stunned. James watched in awe as Elara stepped forward, her energy pulsing stronger with each step. The fear that had filled her eyes earlier had been replaced with determination. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. "Stay back, James," she said, her voice steady, almost commanding. "I'll handle this." James hesitated, but he could see the confidence in her eyes. She was still weak, but she had power, the kind of power he could never understand. He stepped back, keeping his eyes on the fallen alien. Elara's hand raised again, and a bright beam of energy shot out, striking the alien hunter directly in the chest. The force of the blast was enough to make the ground tremble beneath them. The alien screamed, his voice distorted, as his body absorbed the energy. But instead of falling, he stood, shakily, and glared at them with rage. "You think you can defeat me?" he snarled. "I will bring reinforcements. Your lives will be over soon." But Elara didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, her energy growing more intense with each passing moment. The glowing blue light surrounded her like a shield, a symbol of her strength. James watched, his heart racing, as the battle between Elara and the alien reached its peak. The street around them had become a battlefield, a place where technology, power, and desperation collided. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for freedom. And James had no intention of losing. Elara's voice was calm, but her words cut through the air with the sharpness of a blade. "This is where your hunt ends," she said, her eyes locked on the alien, "and where we finally take back control." James didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. The battle for their lives wasn't over yet. The air was thick with tension as the alien, battered but far from defeated, stood up once more. His body was covered in deep burns, and his armor was cracked in several places, but he wasn't finished yet. His eyes, filled with a mix of anger and desperation, locked onto Elara. She had just used a tremendous amount of energy, and James could see the exhaustion written all over her face. She was pushing herself too hard, too fast, and he feared that the power she was unleashing might be more than she could control. James's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. Elara had managed to push the alien back, but it was clear that they weren't out of danger yet. The alien wasn't a regular soldier. He was a hunter, a predator trained to track and eliminate his targets. And Elara wasn't just any target. She was his prey, and he would stop at nothing to capture her. "James," Elara gasped, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "You have to leave. This fight, it's too much for me. I'm not strong enough." James shook his head, refusing to leave her. "No way. I'm not leaving you behind." The alien growled, his voice low and menacing. "Your defiance will be your end, human. You cannot protect her. You will die just like all the others who try to stop us." Elara stood her ground, her energy flickering around her like a storm ready to break. "We'll see about that." The alien moved with lightning speed, charging toward her with a roar. His weapon crackled with energy, and he aimed it directly at Elara. She barely had time to react before the blast hit her, sending her crashing to the ground. James's heart stopped as he saw her collapse, the energy field around her flickering and fading. "No," James shouted, running toward her. He ignored the pain in his legs, the weariness creeping into his muscles, and focused solely on getting to her. He reached her just as the alien prepared for another strike. Elara was breathing hard, but she was still alive. Her skin glowed faintly, a sign that she was still holding on to some of her power. James knelt beside her, lifting her up as the alien closed in. "You're not taking her," James yelled, his voice filled with determination. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained for this kind of battle. But he knew that he couldn't back down now. He had to fight, not just for himself, but for Elara, the only person who had ever believed in him. The alien paused, watching them both with cold, calculating eyes. "You're a fool," he sneered. "You think you can protect her. You're weak, human, and you will pay the price for your stupidity." James tightened his grip on Alara, pulling her closer. "I'll die before I let you take her." Without another word, he pushed Alara behind him, using his own body as a shield. The alien raised his weapon once more, the energy beam glowing ominously. But just as the alien fired, something unexpected happened. Alara's energy flared to life again, brighter and more powerful than before. She reached out, her hand crackling with the raw force of her power, and redirected the alien's blast back toward him. The energy beam hit the alien square in the chest, sending him flying backward with a scream. The force of the blast threw him into the side of a building, where he collapsed in a heap, unmoving. For a moment, the only sound that could be heard was the crackling of energy and the distant hum of the city. James's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the fallen alien. He had no idea what had just happened, but he wasn't going to question it. They had won, at least for now. Alara's breathing was labored, but she managed to sit up, her hand resting on James's arm for support. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with exhaustion. "But we're not safe yet. There are more of them. They'll keep coming." James shook his head. "We'll deal with them when the time comes. Right now, we need to rest." Alara nodded weakly. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. My power, it's fading. I've been running on empty for too long." James looked around, his mind still racing. They were in enemy territory, with no real way of knowing where to go or what to do next. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. He would protect her, no matter what it took. "Listen," James said, his voice steady. "We've made it this far. We're not giving up now." Alara gave him a tired smile, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't deserve your help, but I'm glad you're here." "You don't have to thank me," James replied, helping her to her feet. "We're in this together." As they made their way through the war-torn city, the danger was far from over. But for the first time, James felt a sense of hope. He had faced death, and he had fought against impossible odds, and somehow he had come out the other side. Alara was no longer just the alien woman he had rescued. She was someone he cared about, someone worth fighting for. The weight of the battle ahead loomed large, but they would face it together. No matter what happened next, James knew one thing for certain. He would never back down. He would fight to the end, for Alara and for humanity's future. The days passed in a blur, with the constant fear of being discovered and hunted. James and Alara found refuge in an abandoned building, their only company being the distant sounds of war echoing throughout the city. Despite the danger, there was something comforting in their solitude, a shared understanding that they were in this together. It was during these quiet moments that something began to change between them, something neither of them had expected. James had always considered himself a loner. His life had been filled with rejection, loneliness, and a sense that no one ever truly saw him. But Alara was different. She saw him in a way that no one ever had. She trusted him, believed in him, and most of all, she depended on him. And in turn, James found himself drawn to her, not just because of the bond they shared in the battle for survival, but because of something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. One evening, as the sun set behind the war-torn city, casting an orange glow across the sky, James and Alara sat together in the building's crumbling corner. They hadn't spoken much in hours, each lost in their own thoughts. James stared out of the broken window, his mind wandering, while Alara sat with her back against the wall, her eyes closed as she tried to conserve what little energy she had left. "It's strange," Alara said quietly, breaking the silence. "How we ended up here, how we ended up together." James turned to look at her, his gaze softening. "Yeah. I never thought I'd be fighting alongside an alien princess, especially not for something like this." Alara gave him a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Neither did I, but you've done more for me than anyone ever has. And for that, I'm grateful." James's heart skipped a beat at her words. He had always done what he thought was right, but to hear her express gratitude, real gratitude, was something he wasn't used to. It made him feel seen. It made him feel important. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." Alara shook her head. "No, you don't understand. You're not like anyone else. You don't look at me with fear or disgust. You don't see me as a weapon or a tool to be used. You see me as me." James's chest tightened at her words. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain the emotions that were swelling inside him. He had spent his entire life being overlooked, dismissed, and now this alien woman, this warrior princess, was seeing him in a way that made him feel more alive than he had ever felt. "I never thought I'd feel this way," James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd care about someone, let alone an alien. But I do. I care about you, Alara." Alara's eyes widened slightly at his confession. There was a brief moment of silence between them, the air thick with unspoken words. Alara's heart raced in her chest as she processed what James had said. She had been feeling something too, something that went beyond gratitude, beyond the bond they had formed in the chaos of war. She had been drawn to him from the moment they met, but she had pushed those feelings aside, thinking them to be a product of their shared struggle. Now, hearing him speak those words out loud, she realized that it wasn't just the war that had brought them together. Alara began, but her voice faltered. She wasn't sure how to express what she was feeling. "I feel the same way." James's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. In that instant, nothing else mattered. There were no enemies, no battles, no war. There was only the two of them, sitting in the crumbling ruins of a world that had forgotten how to love. And in that silence, their connection deepened, becoming something more than just survival. It became something real, something worth fighting for. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," James said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But I know that I don't want to face it without you." Alara's heart skipped a beat at his words, and without thinking, she reached out and gently took his hand in hers. The simple gesture was more intimate than anything they had shared before, and it sent a surge of warmth through both of them. "I don't want to face it without you either," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, James allowed himself to believe in something other than survival. He believed in this moment, in the way Alara's touch made him feel, in the way her presence gave him hope. They were from different worlds, different species, but in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the connection they shared, the bond that had formed between them through the trials of war. As the night wore on, they sat together in silence, neither of them wanting to break the fragile peace they had found. The outside world could wait. For now, they had each other, and that was enough. In the midst of the chaos and the destruction that surrounded them, James had found something he had never expected: love. And in Alara, he had found someone who saw him for who he truly was. It didn't matter that they came from different worlds, that their futures were uncertain. What mattered was that they had found something worth fighting for. And as the night deepened, James held Alara's hand, feeling a sense of peace he had never known before. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to face it with her by his side. Because together, they were unstoppable.